Hey everybody, this is chapter 5 of Helmut Wagner's Bolshevism, Its Roots, Role, Class View, and Methods. Chapter 5 is titled The Leninist Theory of Class Consciousness. The Bolshevik attitude of professional revolutionary leaderism was encouraged by the low degree of self-consciousness which characterized the Russian proletariat at the turn of the century. Capitalist development in the country had not yet raised the Russian worker to a distinct political or economic class outlook. He still had one foot in the illiterate serfdom of the village. When he did begin to rebel, in an epoch of advanced world capitalism, against the conditions of his existence, he did so with the spontaneity belonging to the proletariat of early capitalism. This peculiarity of the Russian industrial workers, the fact that they possessed the social disposition of the proletariat of early capitalism in an era of advanced capitalism, made them especially valuable for the Russian Revolution. As a class, they were in the condition to be easily led and manipulated by the revolutionary intelligentsia of their country. The Bolsheviki appreciated the industrial proletariat of Russia as an early capitalist force, dull in self-awareness but mighty in revolt. Preobrazhensky, writing in the symposium entitled Lenin, describes the Russian proletariat as follows, quote, "Our working class is a young and powerful barbarian, still unspoiled by the civilization of the capitalist Rome, still free from the habit of prizing petty bourgeois comforts, the crumbs falling from the tables of the colonial exploiters, is a barbarian that has not yet been tamed by bourgeois law and capitalist order," end quote. The Bolsheviki wanted to bridle this barbarian and ride him into battle. Being afraid of sinking in this primitiveness of the Russian proletariat, the Bolsheviki tolerated no talk of organizational democracy. If the Bolsheviki had been representative of the working class of Russia, the Bolsheviki would have tried by all means to overcome the low degree of class self-consciousness of the Russian workers. The Bolsheviki would have tried to develop this force into a real worker party, having this party crystallize in the process of the class struggle as a result of the increased class consciousness of the Russian proletariat. Capitalism teaches the workers to labor its way. Capitalism teaches the workers to think politically. The Workers' Party can only arise out of this political thinking of the workers. The fighting organization of the proletariat finds its form not at the historic beginning of the class, but late in the class's development. Not representing the class interests of the Russian proletariat, the Bolsheviki turned its very primitiveness into a theory justifying their own Jacobinical pretensions to leadership. They refused to recognize that the cultural backwardness of the Russian laboring masses was the product of a retarded half-feudal, half-capitalist social situation, which had to be overcome by the rising class. They preferred to see the cultural backwardness of the Russian proletariat as an immutable fact that could only be removed, quote, from outside, end quote. This outlook determined the stand they took toward the working class. The theory which expressed this attitude and provided a basis for the then commencing organizational activity of the Bolsheviki was formulated during the Iskra period of the party. The Iskra organization arose after the break that took place in the Russian revolutionary movement over the question of, quote, economism, end quote. The economists wanted to limit the activity of the working people to the economic field. The Iskra people, headed by Lenin, opposed the economists with the argument that the workers' economic struggle, a necessary consequence of the workers' position in the process of capitalist production, could only lead to trade union consciousness. Lenin wrote in What is to be Done, quote, "The history of all countries shows that by its own forces, the working class can only arrive at a trade union consciousness, that is, at the realization of the need of getting together in unions in order to wage a struggle against the exploiters and to demand from the government this or that law necessary for the workers, etc., end quote. Lenin. According to Lenin, trade union consciousness is an element of the, quote, spontaneous, end quote, working class movement. That is, the labor movement as it may be when left to the labor movement's own resources by the revolutionary intellectuals. Lenin wrote that the basic error of the economists lay in their belief that The political class consciousness of the workers could develop, quote, from the inside, end quote. That is, as a result of the workers' struggle in the economic field. Trade unionism, Lenin held, automatically bars the workers from an independent development of their consciousness toward an understanding of the need of socialism. The, quote, spontaneous, end quote, development of the labor movement, Lenin wrote, leads, quote, to their, parenthesis, the workers, end parenthesis, subordination to bourgeois ideology, end quote. It denotes the, quote, ideological enslavement of the workers by the bourgeoisie, end quote. Lenin. If the last observation is correct, then the conception that the, quote, spontaneous, end quote, development of the labor movement can go no further than trade unionism is obviously false. What course the, quote, spontaneous, end quote, parenthesis, that is, independent, end parenthesis, development of the working class takes depends finally on the social hypothesis, on the aggregate of existing social conditions. A badly organized, quote, spontaneously, end quote, rising mass of workers can attain a high degree of socialist consciousness in the fire of battle, in the midst of a critical situation. On the other hand, an old and well-organized mass of workers may, in spite of all influence, quote, from the outside, end quote, remain with no more than a trade unionist outlook, if it finds a certain satisfaction of its, quote, reformist, end quote, interest in a relatively secure situation in capitalism. A relatively secure situation of capitalism. The beginnings of political organization may be developed by the working class in the, quote, spontaneous, end quote, struggle itself. Such organizations will exert a further political influence on the class. They will tend to raise the consciousness of the class. Yet they do not constitute a force outside the working class. They are still part and parcel of the working class. Their activity is a part of the total experience of the mass of workers living through the process of becoming aware of themselves as a class. Considering the situation from his Jacobinical watchtower, Lenin denied that the working people could, by themselves, develop the organizational and political elements necessary for a victory over capitalism. His thesis contradicted itself. Lenin called himself a socialist, and repeating Marx, Lenin declared in eloquent moments that socialism could only be the workers' own creation. At the same time, Lenin took the position that the very class which was said to be destined as the historical instrument for the realization of socialism could not by itself develop an understanding of the need of socialism. This was the complementary half of the theory according to which socialism was to be the product of the, quote, ideological development, end quote, of the intelligentsia. Thus the proletariat, spoken of flatteringly as the historic bearer of socialism, could attain no more than a bourgeois consciousness, if left to its own class resources. The only possible creator of a socialist consciousness were the intellectual strata of society, a part of the bourgeoisie. As Lenin saw the matter, socialism would be achieved by the working class, but the idea of the need of socialism, that is, socialist thought, could only be the creation of the bourgeois intelligentsia. Lenin wrote, quote, political class consciousness can only be brought to the workers from the outside, that is, outside of the economic struggle, outside of the orbit of the relations existing between all classes and social strata and the state, that is, in the sphere of relations existing among all classes, end quote. Lenin. Reaching such conclusions, Lenin denied completely the political character of the economic struggle, a fundamental principle of Marxism. As seen by Marx, the productive relation between the workers and the capitalists is the basic relationship of bourgeois society. From this relation are derived all the appearances and movements characteristic of capitalism. Lenin made it quite clear that, unlike Marx, Lenin did not locate the basis for the rise of socialism in the development of the productive forces. Of all the forces of production, the working class is the most important, is the social element that is most cruelly affected by the contradictions of capitalism, and all these contradictions had their roots in the productive process of society. The thinking of the workers cannot escape being influenced by the capitalist contradictions. This influence brings the workers to reach in time definite conclusions regarding their position in society. It leads them to act to accomplish a fundamental transformation of the existing productive relationship. In other words, socialist consciousness arises, of necessity, out of the productive process of capitalism. Within this sphere of interest, the socialist consciousness of the working people develops into a political force, moving them to socialist action. For Lenin, the movement for socialism was simply a trick of ideology. Lenin believed that only a political force outside of itself could provide the working class with political consciousness. Quote, "From the outside," end quote, meant for Lenin not merely outside the productive process, as is suggested by the last quotation. It meant also outside of the working class. Lenin argued that all, quote, "spontaneous," end quote, social thinking by the workers could, quote, "for obvious reasons," end quote, only lead to bourgeois ideology, since bourgeois ideology is, quote, "older than socialist ideology and more fully developed, and disposes of incomparably greater means of diffusion," end quote. However, the workers' economic struggle leads to a so-called bourgeois (opportunist and reformist) political activity on the workers' part only insofar as the ruling class can succeed, when permitted by the conditions of capitalist production, in keeping the lot of the proletariat within the bounds of toleration. Trade unionism is the product of a certain phase of capitalist development. Trade unionism is obviously not the product of bourgeois propaganda. Trade unionism is the product of a certain phase of capitalist development. Trade unionism is obviously not the product of bourgeois propaganda. Lenin explained the tendency of the working class toward trade unionist and reformist action, not by social causes but by ideological influence. According to Lenin, the proletariat is provided its social consciousness by elements outside of the proletariat itself. According to Lenin, the proletariat receives the proletariat's social outlook in the shape of ready-made ideology, either from the bourgeoisie or from the revolutionary intelligentsia. For the proletariat is incapable of independent social thought. The proletariat cannot develop its own consciousness as a class. The proletariat will therefore always be the object of propaganda by social elements outside of itself. Footnote: the Bolsheviki hold fast to this theory to this day. See, for example, Popov's Outline of the History of Bolshevism, page 69, and Kanorin, Short History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, page 7, end footnote. Lenin wrote in 1901 that the workers' organizations that had been formed under the auspices of the Greek Catholic Church and the monarchists were also a, quote, "necessary product of the interaction of certain relations and elements," end quote. In this case, it was, quote, "the consciousness of the priest and the Zubatovs that participated in the interaction, and not the consciousness of the socialists," end quote. The proletariat attains, quote, "the level of self-consciousness," end quote, when it submits either to the priest and the Zubatovs or to the Bolshevist Social Democrats. How did Lenin happen to arrive at this conclusion? Lenin arrived at such a conclusion because Lenin belonged to the special section of society whose task it is to fashion ideologies. To Lenin's, quote, "socialist," end quote, activity, Lenin transferred something that is a special feature of class society, the separation between mental and manual labor. Lenin mistook ideologic appearance for the substance of the thing, forgetting that also in the labor movement, an intellectual can only formulate and not create. The ideas that begin to enter the heads of the workers as a result of the experience of the class struggle. Lenin considered himself to be a creator of a specific ideology. Lenin was, in fact, only the, quote, "mouthpiece," end quote, of certain social forces. Lenin called himself a, quote, Marxist, end quote. But Lenin never held anything more than an idealistic view of the political tendencies of his time, which are themselves creating the material process of social development. In Lenin's conception of, quote, political consciousness, end quote, there is no question of proletarian socialism. The sort of, quote, consciousness, end quote, Lenin had in mind was something by means of which the working class could be mobilized and assigned a task in a bourgeois revolution. Considered from the angle of the bourgeois revolution, Lenin's stand that the, quote, political consciousness, end quote, of the working class could only be developed by a political force originating outside of the working class has a real meaning. Lenin's thesis then amounts to the following. The political thought by which the workers were going to be mobilized for action in the complicated revolution against Tsarism can only be the creation of the Jacobinical intelligentsia. The political thought by which the workers were going to be mobilized for action in the complicated revolution against Tsarism could only be the creation of the Jacobinical intelligentsia. This was true to the extent that the expected revolution presented tasks such as the peasant question, which could not be mastered on the basis of the struggle of the proletariat acting in its historic role as a force for socialism. The chief problem in this revolution was not the doing away with the capitalist productive relationship, but the destruction of the vestiges of feudalism. Quite naturally, the Russian working class could not develop, quote, spontaneously, end quote. That is, out of its position within the process of capitalist production, an insight into the needs of an anti-feudal revolution. This is the essential meaning of Lenin's thesis on the, quote, political consciousness, end quote, of the proletariat. We see that it does not refer to self-awareness of a working class acting for socialism. It refers to the consciousness of a working class participating in a bourgeois revolution, for which it must be mobilized as an important auxiliary force. Lenin's, quote, Marxist, end quote, terminology is a disguise veiling an outlook that is typical of the Jacobinical intelligentsia. The Bolshevik theory of class consciousness was not created by Lenin. Already in 1891, Akselrod wrote, quote, the labor movement cannot leave the narrow course of pure economic conflict between the workers and the entrepreneurs. In general, is quite devoid of a political character. In the struggle for political freedom, however, the advanced sections of the proletariat follow the revolutionary circles and the fractions of the so-called intelligentsia, end quote. Out of this idea of Akselrod's, Lenin drew all possible inferences. Lenin felt himself to be on safe ground, especially because he found the same viewpoint expressed in the writings of Kautsky, the, quote, leader of the German Revolutionary Social Democrats, end quote. Kautsky wrote in the year 1901, quote, the modern socialist consciousness can only arise on the basis of profound scientific insight, ... The bearer of this science is, however, not the worker, but the bourgeois intellectual. Modern socialism originated among members of this stratum of society, by whom it was transmitted to culturally outstanding proletarians wherever conditions permitted this diffusion. Socialist consciousness is therefore something injected into the class struggle and is not native to it, end quote. Kautsky. Upon this vulgar theory of class consciousness, the Bolsheviki raised the slogan, quote, the intelligentsia must bring political consciousness to the proletariat, end quote. In 1902, Lenin attacked the proposition expressed in the Principles of the Labor Alliance of the North, which considered, quote, socialism to be in the class interest of the proletariat, end quote. Lenin wrote that such an outlook was, quote, extremely inexact, ambiguous, and dangerous, end quote. And Lenin sermonized the proletariat authors of the program to the effect that, quote, into the class struggle of the proletariat, developing spontaneously on the basis of capitalist relations, socialism is carried by ideologists, end quote. According to Lenin, the workers' class interests render them susceptible to socialism, but no more than that. The conception of socialism depends on an ideology that is founded on the, quote, entire storehouse of man's knowledge, end quote. In Lenin's development of this theory of class consciousness, Lenin supported himself on the writings and authority of Plekhanov. But neither was Plekhanov without predecessors. Lavrov, one of the theorists of the old Narodnik movement, believed, in the manner of certain spokesmen of the early German socialist movement, that, quote, critically thinking personalities, the intellectuals, end quote, constituted the main forces of social progress. Popov summarizes Lavrov's idea in the following words, quote, they were going to spread socialist knowledge among the people. They were going to lead the dark, ignorant masses to the light of socialism, end quote. Parenthesis, outline of the history of Bolshevism, page 14, end parenthesis. Popov. In principle, this outlook was no different from Lenin's. Lavrov represented the Narodnik movement of enlightenment. Lenin represented Bolshevism. Both made use of the idea and the language of socialism in order to, quote, get close to the people, end quote, and restate attractively their bourgeois revolutionary aims. The essential difference between the two ideologists lay not in the principle of their activity, but in the dissimilarity of their tactics. When he spoke of the enlightenment of the, quote, masses, end quote, Lenin did not mean the workers exclusively. Lenin's conception of consciousness applied also to the petty bourgeoisie, especially to the peasants. He wrote in 1906, quote, the proletariat can overcome the hesitancy of the petty bourgeoisie only by promoting the class consciousness and solidarity of the masses, and by enabling them to learn by their experience. There is no other, and can be no other, means of overcoming the hesitancy of the petty bourgeoisie, end quote. Lenin returned to the question of class consciousness during the revolutionary period of 1917. At that time, Lenin explained that the masses had failed to take power in their hands in February only because the proletariat was, quote, not sufficiently class conscious and organized, end quote. Quote, the cause is the insufficient self-consciousness and organization of the proletarians and peasants, end quote. Lenin called for a policy of, quote, unmasking, end quote, the provisional government for the purpose of advancing the, quote, clarification of the self-consciousness of the people, end quote. In other words, whenever the aims of Bolshevism could be helped by the concept of class consciousness, it was a good thing. But it was good only to the extent that the increased class consciousness of the masses meant their support of the policies of the Bolshevik Party and their recognition and obedience of the Bolshevik leadership. That's the end of Chapter 5 of Rudolf Sprenger, a.k.a. Helmut Wagner's Bolshevism, its roots, role, class, view, and methods.